In late 16th century Europe, a Chinese porcelain cup could be treated less like tableware than treasure. Goldsmiths wrapped imported porcelain in gilded silver, while courts tried to reproduce a material that arrived finished, but without the workshop knowledge that made it possible. Florence's Medici court came close in the 1570s, but its soft-paced imitation was not the hard, translucent porcelain Europeans admired. More than a century later, Saxon experimenters were still breaking, firing, comparing, and failing. So what exactly was Europe chasing? A clay, a recipe, or an entire production system? And why did finding the right material still not solve the problem? Start with the cup itself. One surviving Ming vessel, now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, was made in China sometime between about 1507 and 1566. Around 1570, a London goldsmith fitted it with gilded silver mounts. The ceramic had crossed continents, then entered a European metalworking tradition designed for precious things. The mount did not make the porcelain technically better. It changed how the object was framed, handled, and valued. That treatment was not unique. Chinese porcelain had reached Europe by the 14th century, and surviving early imports were often rare enough to be mounted in precious metal. By the 16th century, Portuguese maritime trade was bringing larger quantities westward. More porcelain could circulate, more people could see it, and more workshops could study what they were holding. Yet access to the finished object created a peculiar kind of frustration. You could weigh it, tap it, hold it to light, inspect the glaze, copy the painted decoration, and reproduce the shape. None of those observations told you exactly how the body had been prepared, what raw materials had been selected, how the kiln had been managed, or how craftsmen judged whether a firing was going right. By the early 16th century, Chinese producers were also responding to Western demand, making some wares specifically for export. That makes the European side of the story even more paradoxical. Consumers could influence shapes and decoration across an ocean while remaining unable to reproduce the ceramic body itself. Trade transmitted preferences much faster than it transmitted production competence. The object could travel farther than the process. To understand that gap, it helps to forget the idea that Chinese porcelain was one timeless recipe guarded by a single door. China contained multiple ceramic centers, traditions, materials, and technical lineages. Jingdezhen became especially important because it could organize enormous production around porcelain, serving imperial demand, domestic markets, and long-distance trade. The finished wares that reached Europe were the visible end of that system. A porcelain vessel compresses many decisions into a smooth surface. Raw materials have to be selected and refined. The body must survive forming, drying, and extreme heat. Glaze and body have to behave compatibly. The kiln must deliver conditions that transform a fragile, shaped mass into a hard, dense ceramic. Workers need to recognize defects and adjust. A successful piece is evidence that all of those problems were solved together. It is not an instruction manual for solving them again somewhere else. Europeans were not the only people outside China to develop porcelain production. In early 17th century Japan, Korean potters living in the Arita region worked within an existing ceramic infrastructure, including climbing kilns, and found suitable material for porcelain production. That parallel development matters because it breaks a tempting but false binary. This is not a story in which China possessed a mystical substance and Europe eventually stole it. It is a story about how demanding material systems can be reconstructed when raw materials, furnaces, skilled people, institutions, and markets align. For European courts, however, imported Asian porcelain created a very specific challenge. They already had the result in their hands. Their problem was to work backward from it. Reverse engineering sounds straightforward when the object can be cut apart into visible components. Porcelain was different. Its precise history had been erased by the firing that made it porcelain. Heat had transformed the evidence. That is why the first great European success is more revealing as a failure. In Florence, around 1574, experiments began under Francesco I de' Medici to make porcelain in imitation of highly prized Chinese blue and white wares. Surviving Medici porcelain proves that the effort produced real objects, not just courtly rumor. A ewer, made around 1575 to 1587, is white, decorated in blue, and recognizably part of the visual world that Chinese imports had helped create. But the body is soft paste porcelain. That distinction is the first major reversal in Europe's chase. The Florentine workshop had crossed one boundary. Europeans could create a ceramic that looked enough like porcelain to earn the name and survive as a serious court product. Yet resemblance was not equivalence. Soft paste bodies relied on different material systems than the hard paste porcelains admired from China. They could produce whiteness and translucency, but they behaved differently in production and use. The Medici experiment, therefore, did something more interesting than fail. It separated two problems that are easy to confuse. One was visual imitation. The other was material replication. Visual imitation could begin from the object in front of you. A painter could study cobalt decoration. A modeler could trace a profile. A goldsmith could borrow the silhouette of a vessel. Material replication demanded knowledge that the finished piece concealed. What ingredients could survive the necessary heat? How should they be prepared? How did the body shrink? When did it warp? How did glaze interact with the ceramic beneath it? Which defect came from material, which from forming, which from firing? A court could spend money on experiments without possessing the answers. A craftsman could possess extraordinary skill in one ceramic tradition without automatically knowing another. A written recipe could specify ingredients while leaving out the practiced judgment that made them work. And one successful object would still not prove that a workshop could make the next 100 with consistent quality. That last problem is where stories about secret formulas usually become misleading. A formula is attractive because it turns history into a lock-and-key puzzle. Find the hidden ingredient, insert it, and the mystery opens. Porcelain production behaves more like a chain of gates. Passing one only exposes the next. The desired properties were obvious enough to European observers: a pale body, a hard surface, relative non-porosity, the ability to take brilliant decoration, and in thinner pieces, a degree of translucency. But each property emerged from a transformation that had to be controlled. If the body cracked while drying, the recipe was useless. If it slumped or deformed in the kiln, whiteness did not save it. If firing varied from one part of a kiln to another, a promising batch could become a pile of rejects. That makes failure historical evidence. A cracked vessel tells you that the workshop had not yet stabilized some part of the system. A warped form exposes the violence of shrinkage and heat. A batch that works once and fails the next shows the difference between experiment and manufacturing. European makers explored substitutes, mixtures, glazes, and firing practices for generations. Some results were beautiful in their own right. Delftware, stoneware, glass, and soft paste porcelain could satisfy parts of the market without reproducing Chinese hard paste porcelain. The chase did not proceed as one continuous research program from the 14th century to the 18th. Different courts and workshops acted at different moments for different reasons. Centuries of chasing describes recurring fascination, imitation, and technical pursuit, not a single laboratory operating without interruption. By the end of the 17th century, one of the most important experimental programs had formed in Saxony. Its story would later be compressed around one extraordinary man. The surviving evidence points instead toward a network. Ehrenfried Walter von Tschirnhaus was a mathematician, natural philosopher, instrument maker, and experimenter with intense heat. From the 1690s, he conducted systematic melting experiments related to porcelain. His work with burning mirrors and high-temperature processes had already pushed him toward questions of furnaces, materials, and transformation. Then, Johann Friedrich Böttger entered the story under very different circumstances. Trained as an apothecary and fascinated by alchemy, he became famous for claims surrounding the transformation of base materials into gold. He came under the control of Augustus the Strong, ruler of Saxony and king of Poland, whose court had both the resources and appetite to sponsor difficult material experiments. The cinematic version almost writes itself. An alchemist imprisoned by a porcelain-obsessed king cracks China's secret. But that version is too clean. By 1704, Böttger was working under Tschirnhaus's supervision. Gottfried Pabst von Ohain, a mining expert, was also involved. Around them were other specialists whose work mattered even when their names rarely headline the story. People who found and tested earths, built and operated furnaces, formed bodies, polished surfaces, modeled shapes, and evaluated failures. The Saxon breakthrough came from a court-backed experimental system. Before white porcelain, that system produced something else. A dense red stoneware capable of surviving very high firing temperatures. It was not merely a detour. The material forced experimenters to understand how bodies behaved under heat and helped drive improvements in kiln technology. Meissen later sold sophisticated red stoneware objects, some polished until their surfaces resembled worked stone. Augustus's own Chinese ceramics became working evidence. In November 1709, he sent Chinese porcelain objects to Böttger for copying. A figure of Guan Yin in the royal collection became one of the models. The shape could be duplicated through casting. The material could not simply be copied by looking. Tschirnhaus's path shows why the breakthrough cannot be reduced to a lucky clay sample. In 1701 and 1702, the Saxon court sent him to the Netherlands and France, where he investigated ceramic production while also pursuing markets for Saxon glass. He returned to a region with mining knowledge, experimental furnaces, court finance, and a ruler willing to sustain costly trials. Those resources did not guarantee success, but they changed what failure could become. A broken firing was no longer only a wasted object. Inside an organized program, it could become information for the next test. That distinction is crucial. Craft knowledge accumulates through comparison. One earth behaves differently from another. One furnace design holds heat differently. One body may form well and then fail after firing. Someone has to notice those differences, remember them, and connect them to the previous batch. The secret, therefore, grew through a sequence of judgments spread across people and experiments. A court collection became more than display. It supplied physical benchmarks against which experimental bodies could be compared. In 1708, the Saxon experiments produced a white porcelain body. Kaolin mattered. But calling Kaolin the secret collapses the story at exactly the moment it becomes most interesting. A pile of suitable clay is not a porcelain factory. The body had to be prepared correctly. Other components had to work with it. The shaped object had to survive drying and shrinkage. The kiln had to reach and sustain demanding conditions. The workers had to understand a process that could punish small variations with cracks, warping, or complete loss. Even after the material composition advanced, firing remained a major bottleneck. The Porcelain Sammlung in Dresden preserves a blunt reminder from the early Meissen story. Archival records repeatedly report misfires and rejects. The first Meissen kiln acquired the mocking nickname Lucky Pot. Large vases could emerge deformed or cracked and still enter the royal collection, physical evidence of how difficult the firing remained. The museum describes mastery of firing as no less decisive than discovering the body formula. The bottleneck had moved. Europe's porcelain problem was never just the absence of one ingredient. The harder challenge was building a reproducible system. That system included explicit knowledge, which materials to try, what proportions to explore, which temperatures a furnace needed to withstand. It also included tacit knowledge, what a workable body felt like, how a forming process behaved, when a firing looked wrong, which defect could be corrected, and which meant the batch was lost. And it included institutional knowledge, how to obtain raw materials, organize specialists, protect experiments, finance repeated failure, and compare results. Tschirnhaus died in October 1708, the same year white porcelain was achieved. That timing is one reason priority remains difficult. Later memory often placed Böttger alone at the center. Modern scholarship is more cautious. The decisive conditions, including material composition and furnace work, were cumulative, and the experimental network did not stop at one triumphant test. An experimental breakthrough had answered only one question: could porcelain be made here? The next challenge was production. In January 1710, Augustus announced the establishment of a porcelain factory in Dresden. Equipment was moved to Meissen that June. The location and institution mattered because the court now had to turn experimental knowledge into repeatable output. That transition is easy to underestimate. An experiment asks, can this be done? A manufactory asks, can it be done again, by a coordinated group, on a schedule, with materials arriving, kilns operating, defects sorted, and objects good enough to sell. Early Meissen was a breakthrough, but it was still a work in progress. In 1708, true white porcelain had been produced without glaze. Ongoing experiments solved additional technical problems. By the Leipzig Easter Fair of 1713, Meissen had successfully introduced hard-paste porcelain commercially. The breakthrough was becoming a market. Yet the factory did not suddenly possess every decorative technique associated with Asian porcelain. Color development lagged. Early whitewares often relied on shape and sculptural surface. Red stoneware continued to be produced. Specialists had to translate a new material into forms consumers wanted. The Guanyin copies reveal that translation in physical form. Meissen first reproduced the Chinese figure in red stoneware, and later in hard-paste porcelain. The copies were smaller because the material shrank during drying and firing. That is a tiny detail with a large meaning. Even when the external form was borrowed directly, the production process rewrote it. The copy was not a download of Chinese knowledge. It was a local reconstruction, passing through Saxon clays, Saxon kilns, Saxon labor, court priorities, and the material behavior of a new production system. Meissen had crossed the replication gate. Now it faced the consequence of success. Once porcelain could be made in Europe, technical exclusivity became harder to defend. The commercial test mattered because customers were not evaluating chemistry in the abstract. They were buying vessels, figures, and tablewares. Meissen could show that its new body was not merely a laboratory curiosity by putting product into circulation. At the Leipzig Easter Fair in 1710, the factory offered refined red stoneware. By 1713, hard-paste porcelain entered the fair successfully. The sequence makes the scale problem visible. A technically important material could earn attention before white porcelain was fully stabilized, and the workshop could learn how to shape, finish, price, and present products while the larger program continued. Knowledge that works inside a workshop does not stay abstract. It lives in people, routines, tools, suppliers, and repeated gestures. That makes it powerful, but also difficult to contain forever. Meissen initially had reason to guard its methods. The factory's value depended partly on being able to do what rivals could not. Yet Europe already contained experienced ceramic workers, ambitious courts, commercial competitors, and customers eager for porcelain. Once hard-paste production had been demonstrated, the problem changed. Competitors no longer had to believe European porcelain was possible. They knew it was. The spread of porcelain manufacturing across Europe did not mean that every workshop received one complete Meissen recipe and instantly became equivalent. Different centers had to acquire suitable materials, recruit skill, finance kilns, stabilize bodies and glazes, and develop products that could survive comparison in the market. Replication remained a local construction problem. Meanwhile, Chinese porcelain did not freeze in place waiting for Europe to catch up. Jingdezhen and other Asian production centers continued to serve changing markets. Japanese porcelain had already entered international trade in the 17th century, particularly when disruptions in China opened opportunities for Arita producers. The global ceramic world was moving on several fronts at once. Europe's new factories therefore entered an existing field rather than replacing it overnight. Chinese export porcelain continued to circulate. European consumers mixed Asian imports with local production. Decoration crossed borders. Some Chinese porcelain was painted or mounted in Europe. European factories borrowed East Asian shapes and motifs, then transformed them for local tastes. The history becomes less like a stolen crown and more like a multiplying network of material translations. And multiplication created a new problem for Meissen. If a white porcelain body could no longer guarantee uniqueness, the factory needed other ways to make origin visible. That pressure can be seen in an object made at Meissen around 1713 to 1720, and later decorated by an independent painter. In the factory's early decades, Meissen sold some undecorated porcelain to outside painters known as Hausmalers. The arrangement generated revenue and gave independent specialists material they could finish in their own workshops. Some were highly skilled. They could compete with factory decoration and respond directly to customers. For Meissen, technical success had created an awkward market. The body could leave the factory. Decoration could be added elsewhere. A customer looking at the finished object now needed another clue to origin. In 1722, responding to threats to the factory's financial success, Meissen required porcelain sold by the manufactory to carry the crossed swords mark under the glaze. Notice what had happened. At the beginning of the story, value was protected by distance. European buyers could possess Chinese porcelain without possessing its manufacturing system. During the Saxon breakthrough, value depended on a bounded workshop capable of controlling materials, furnaces, and skilled practice. After replication, part of the gate moved again, toward authentication, reputation, and provenance. The secret had not simply been stolen and destroyed. Control had changed form. That shift is why porcelain belongs to more than the history of chemistry. Material transformation solved a technical barrier, but status and institutional identity survived the technical breakthrough. Once several producers could make hard-paste porcelain, differences in quality, decoration, style, and origin still mattered. Knowledge had become more mobile, while prestige found new surfaces on which to attach itself. Sometimes that surface was literally under the glaze. Now return to the 16th century cup wrapped in gilded silver. When it reached Europe, nearly everything that mattered about its making was hidden in plain sight. The finished vessel showed that a certain combination of whiteness, hardness, glaze, form, and decoration was possible. It could be admired, collected, mounted, copied, and traded. But the heat that created it had erased the sequence of decisions behind it. Florence proved that appearance could be imitated without reproducing the same material system. Saxony proved that a new material body could emerge from sustained experiment, but also that a body formula without reliable firing was not a stable industry. Meissen proved that replication had to be converted into production, and production into objects a market would accept. Then the crossed swords showed one final turn. When technical exclusivity weakened, authority could migrate into a mark. That is the part of the porcelain chase that the phrase "China's secret" tends to hide. There was no single, timeless Chinese recipe waiting to be found, and no lone European genius who unlocked an entire civilization's craft in one moment. Porcelain was a package of materials: thermal control, embodied skill, quality judgment, workshop organization, and accumulated experience. Different Asian traditions had built such packages in different places. European experimenters had to build their own. The result changed trade and luxury culture. European factories reduced one kind of dependence on imported porcelain and created new centers of production. But the story does not end with Europe defeating China, because Chinese and Japanese producers remained innovators and competitors within a global ceramic economy. Nor does it end with secrecy disappearing. Every successful manufacturing system still contains knowledge that is easier to see in the finished object than to reconstruct from it. Pick up a porcelain cup today, and the material feels almost silent. Smooth wall, hard rim, glaze catching light. Nothing about it announces failed batches, furnace experiments, court patronage, skilled hands, copied models, or the problem of proving where it came from. Turn over a piece of Meissen, and the crossed swords make that hidden history visible again. Europe spent centuries chasing porcelain because the object could cross a border in a crate. The process could not. To reproduce the object, Europe had to rebuild the invisible system behind it.